Hey everybody, Chris Peters here, and it's another edition of Talking Hockey Sense. It is episode 85 of the podcast, and we are talking NHL Draft today. Got a great show for you. I was at the Combine, but I kind of wasn't. We'll explain that in a little bit, and I'll also have a guest today, Mike Morreale, who I'll bring in just a second. But before we do that, wanted to let you know there is a ton of NHL Draft content on FloHockey right now. You can get my full draft rankings, my full first mock draft, also a number of video scouting reports on players like Zach Benson and Braden Yeager and Colby Barlow and I don't know, some guy named Connor Bedard. You can find all of that on FloHockey.tv. You can also subscribe to the FloHockey YouTube channel where we have plenty more content there, as well as clips from this very podcast. And of course, you can watch every single episode of Talking Hockey Sense on YouTube as well. So without further ado, I can't wait to bring in our guest for today. He is Mike Morreale from the NHL.com, from the NHL.com, from NHL.com. Yes, the NHL.com. He is one of the premier writers about the NHL draft. He also covers the New Jersey Devils. He's a New Jersey High School Hockey Hall of Famer, if I'm correct, Mike. I think I say that every time I've had you on the show. But Mike, welcome to Talking Hockey Sense. Great to have you back.
It's great to be here, Chris. I'm glad you're feeling a little bit better. It was disheartening, and actually, on Saturday during the testing day, I actually saw you Friday during the media avails for the three big prospects. But everyone was asking, where is Chris Peters? Where is Chris Peters on Saturday during the testing? And then ultimately, I had no idea, of course. And then ultimately, I saw your tweet about feeling, a little bit under the weather. So we were all disheartened by that because we love your presence. We love what you bring to the table every time you're around. So it was unfortunate, but I'm glad to be on the program with you today, buddy.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you. Yes. So I got sick on Saturday. I was feeling great Friday, went to the availabilities, even went out to dinner, had a good time with a few friends, woke up the next morning and I was just dripping sweat from a fever. Yeah, we had a little virus go through our family. Don't want to get you into the gory details of it, but it forces me to miss the biggest day of the draft, the draft combine, which is Saturday, which is testing day, which is a great chance to meet a lot of prospects. And that is exactly why I had Mike on here, because not only was he there Saturday, he was there for most of the week talking to players. He's got a great setup there. It's like once you get a player, he's just got grilled by Steve Yzerman. Next, he's got to go talk to Mike Morreale in another room and Adam Kimmelman. I mean, just, oh man, what I could not ask for a worse fate if I'm that young player. But I'm just kidding. Mike asks some of the best questions, and certainly every time I'm in a scrum with him, I steal all of his quotes. So, but Mike, first of all, like I said, you cover the draft extremely well. You're very, you've got a really great insight into central scouting. You get a good setup at the combine, but the big thing about the combine, it's not always about the physical testing. A lot of it really does have to do with the interview process. And so these players are, they're as polished as they've ever been. They're well prepared. They tend to have a lot of good answers. But were there any players that you either heard about or heard from, or that you interviewed yourself that you thought, that's a pretty impressive individual, or maybe they surprised you with something, or maybe there was something memorable that came out of your interactions with some of these draft prospects?
Yeah, Chris, thank you for that. And, as you were talking there, the first player I have to mention, and that was so impressive to me, was Leo Carlsson. Now I know that he's a top level elite prospect of this draft. He's probably going to go top 3, top 4 somewhere. But the thing that really sticks about Leo, and again, we've spoken about this. I mean, I probably talked to about maybe 20, 25 prospects while I was there, in a one-on-one type situation, including Leo. But the thing about Leo that really impressed me, Chris, and you've spoken to him, you know what he's all about. He deals openly with the stutter that he deals with as a player. And when he came into our room and we had him on our podcast, the NHL Draft Class podcast, and before we started the interview, I asked him, I says, "Are you okay if we talk about this?" Because I think, for people that young kids that maybe want to get into hockey or even anything else, some type of profession that are dealing with this, I think it's important, for people, of your stature, where you're going, where you're headed. as a professional athlete, that maybe you can make a difference in their lives. And sure enough, Leo, said, yeah, no problem. And we discussed that, and that'll be on our podcast, the interview. But it was just impressive how he, he said he wanted to talk about it. He did. He said it's something that he's dealt with as a young kid, since he was a young kid, and it hasn't really phased him. He says hockey was a great outlet for him in dealing with it, and he says you would think that it would set him. He said sometimes people think it'll set me back or set you back in some ways, but he goes, you know what? Everyone was so supportive of me in the locker room, on the ice. He says it was great, and to me, like those are some of those feel good stories that you find and that at the combine that maybe you didn't really consider at first. But I read about it, I knew about it a little bit, but I never really wanted to openly discuss it with him because I didn't know how open he was about it. But that was one thing that really caught my eye. Oliver Moore, for the National Team Development Program. His billet family being on the flower farm, I thought was a great story.
Yeah.
I asked Oliver about it. We chatted about it, and I says, did you have to work on the farm? Did you have to pick flowers? Did you put together bouquets? And he's like, nah. He's like, they want to, every morning I got some eggs. I had to, help out eating the eggs in the morning, and they had a barn for him with a net, and the mom and dad there that own the flower farm. And he shot. They have two sons, so the sons are out there shooting pucks with him every day. And I says, well, so you didn't do any work, but so what did you actually do? And he was like, well, I just followed how they were actually running the business, and they openly discussed the business with entrepreneurs that want to put together flower farms and want to build some type of farm in some capacity. And they used Oliver as someone that never gives up, the work habits he puts in, the hard work in becoming a professional athlete, and he was used in that regard. They had him on video, they had him on audio segments. So I thought that was really interesting. Nick Loris, from the OHL in Hamilton.
Mhm.
Obviously, Chris started the year in Peterborough,
Yep.
wasn't having that great a season. And then, the trade comes at the deadline. He goes to Hamilton. He starts lighting it up. I asked him about, well, how does that happen? He goes, well, and obviously it was a little regarding a little bit more ice time, a little bit more confidence in what he was doing. They had him in different situations on the power play, the PK. But these are things you always want to try to grasp and try to gather at the combine because you're not really sure what the player is thinking or what maybe was going through his mind in certain situations. And the other thing, Chris, that I thought was interesting too was Kerry Terrence, player from Erie, and it's very rare. And you obviously have a greater background with the program, the National Team Development Program, than I do. But it's very rare to have now players have come over to compete with
Mhm.
the U.S. team at the U18s. But is it rare to have a player directly from the Canadian Hockey League come and join the club at the at the U18s? And he did fairly well. And I wanted to get the dynamic there. What was it like? I mean, you weren't with this team for much of this season. Was it hard to just go right in, when you get to Switzerland and join this team? He says, you know what? He says, they brought me in. He goes, it was fantastic. The guys, everyone came over, talked to me. We were like brothers right from the outset. Stuff like that, it you feel good about, and you hear stories about the NTTP, but it's stories like that that make you say, you know what, they really do have something going there at the program.
Yeah, and to that point, it is pretty rare to bring a player in from the CHL. It's happened before, but it doesn't happen very often. And I think one of the things that he was able to bring to the table is something, Oliver Moore, who you also mentioned, one of the best skaters in the draft, Kerry Terrence, the same, like he is an
Yes.
absolute speed demon
Yep.
out there, and they needed guys to play with that pace, and so he was able to, he actually ended up getting a piece of the puck while he was falling down for the game tying goal that we initially thought was scored by Cole Iserman. He deflected it. And so not only that, they were putting him out in a late game situation, a must score situation. He was out for that team. So it just shows how quickly he was able to build that trust. And I did want to go back to Leo Carlsson for just a second too, because, you got to get him in a one-on-one setting. we also got him in a large media availability where he was
Mm,
on a stage in front of all of us. And he said that his stutter definitely it's not as pronounced when he's speaking in Swedish, but the fact that he's able to speak a second language as well as he does, and and just the confidence that he projects is always something that strikes me about Leo Carlsson. So
absolutely. Hmm.
I'm not surprised to hear that. And the other thing about Leo is that I think that there are a lot of NHL teams. I don't think it's 100% guaranteed that Adam Fantilli is the number 2 pick, because Leo Carlsson has put himself in a position both as a player and as a person. Just that I think anybody that meets him instantly seems to like the kid. And so he's
Yeah.
got that going for him as well, which helps an awful lot. But yeah, and also on Nick Lardis, not only did he have that tremendous second half, he was one of the top performers at physical testing. And so I did want to talk a little bit about the physical testing stage. Is it going to make or break a player in the NHL draft? I don't think so. But when you're a guy like Nick Lardis, who has a lot to prove, who didn't necessarily have that high end draft pedigree, you put yourself on the map a little bit when you're a top performer in a number of events. So I was just wondering, Mike, from the physical testing standpoint, if there were any other standout performers, different things that you heard from either scouts or strength and conditioning, whoever you may have talked to, or other players about that process and some of the standouts from that.
Yeah, I mean, first off, I'll get to your last question there, Chris, with regard to some of the standouts. And it's funny, and I'll start with Lourdes because he had 15 pull-ups, and it's
Yeah.
interesting here is that Connor Bedard went and did 14 pull-ups, and he jumped to the top of the list, and then Nick Lourdes comes in with the 15 spot. So you're like, wow, that's quite a lot for
Yeah.
Nick to come in and do that. So Bedard, 14 pull-ups, and he was actually tied with Danny Nelson of the NTTP.
Yep.
Bradley Nadeau of Penticton was in there too, and I believe defenseman Cam Allen of Guelph also had 14.
Yes.
But in
Yeah.
addition to the pull-ups, Lourdes had the highest vertical jump. So he was right in there, as far as the testing goes. I know defenseman Jordan Tournay of Shawinigan in the queue led all players in the VO2 max test. I think it was a little over 13 and a half minutes. Michael
Yeah.
Robel of
Insane.
Omaha. Yep. Yeah, it is. It's 13. Are you kidding me? 13 and a half.
No.
Um,
No, thank you.
yeah. Bedard, I think, lasted 12 minutes on the VO2, which
Yeah.
is also kind of
Yeah,
insane when
Bedard.
you think about it.
We should mention that, like, Connor Bedard had a very good combine and had
He
zero
did.
reason
Yes.
to participate. Like, I mean, there was nothing
Yeah.
to gain from it, and that speaks, I think, a little bit to the competitive drive of Connor Bedard. That he's like, I'm not taking anything for granted. Adam Fantilli and Leo Carlsson, if I'm not mistaken, did not participate, but they did just come back from the World Championship, so totally understandable to not, because there is some level of training that has to go into preparing for this, because you can't just go in and just do all those. You have to have some level of training, and a lot of the players do have time. Those two guys didn't have as much time.
And you know what, Chris? As a follow up there, and something I thought that was interesting, Jormo Kekalainen, GM for Columbus, actually spoke later on Saturday when the combine was almost coming to a close, and he said two interesting things that I want to share. First, he was asked about the Fantilli and Carlson opting out of the testing, and believe it or not, he was disappointed that they
Hmm.
didn't test. He said, I think they could have at least sort of showed up, in my opinion, gone through some of the testing. He says, if you're not medically cleared to test, then no problem. But, I think it would have been good to see them test, go through the floor and do some of the tests if they could do that. And it wouldn't have any lingering effects from their season that just ended. So I kind of thought,
That's interesting.
isn't that like Yoma would
But now neither one of them has an advantage over the other in the
That's
Columbus
right.
Blue Jackets room. Yeah.
But the other thing too that I want to share is Kekalainen. Um, we asked him, like, is there any particular test that you really watch or that your scouts really view as important? And he says he watches the three vertical jumps real closely: the vertical leap, the squat jump, and the no arm jump. So all three are performed on a force plate, right?
Yep.
And the leaps are measured by inches of lift off the plate. So Yarmo and I'm trying to remember the quote. He said, if there's a concern about skating and the guy can't get off the force plate, that kind of confirms the concerns that you have on
Yeah.
skating. And then on the other hand, if you see someone who looks really fast on the ice, like the players we just spoke of, Oliver Moore, Kerry Terrence, uh, then they can fly off that thing. It's like, okay, there's a reason why he's such a good skater. So I thought that was interesting that Yormo kind of has that in the
Yeah.
back of mind, thinking about those kind of aspects of the testing part.
Yeah, I didn't know like that was something that he did. That is also the one that I look closest at as well for that
Yep.
reason. And a guy like Nick Lardis, who is a good skater, but I don't think anybody would call him an elite skater in the class. He's certainly one of the better skaters, but like he dominated at those kind of things. And so that gives you a whole different kind of perspective on that, or it confirms things, or it gives you reason to have other concerns. Other high end athletes, some of the big guys. You mentioned Danny Nelson. He's a bigger player. Going. It's hard for big guys to do the pull ups like that, and he managed to crush 14 of those. The VO2 max and different things like that.
Yep.
They certainly help a lot to judge athleticism. I think sometimes on the pull-ups, you're looking to see if, how hard is the guy going to fight to make this work? And so there's all different kind of things that come from it. But really
Real
fascinating
quick,
stuff from Yarmo as well. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
yeah, yeah, real quick. As you're talking there, Chris, I'm remembering, in years past, right? A big deal was made over the fact that players such as Sam Bennett, Casey Middlestat couldn't complete a single chin up, right, at the combine.
Yeah, yeah,
And here you
yeah,
have Bennett has already played 9 full NHL seasons. He reached the Stanley Cup final, a valiant effort by the Florida Panthers. And then Middlestat just finished his 5th season with the Sabres, had career highs in goals, assist, points, I believe. So you know what? You just have to push, right, Chris? That's what it's
yeah.
all about. As long as you show these scouts, these general managers that you're willing to give maximum effort, and if that means struggling to maybe get even one pull up, then it's worth it. That's what they want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think the combine is very interesting. Like, and a lot of the, you'll see the GMs and you'll probably see scouting directors there, but like they send a lot of their area scouts home. That they let the strength and conditioning coaches
Yeah.
watch those things, so they get reports on that as well. But it's always fascinating to see who's there watching, and they are watching, and they're not watching because they want to see they'll get the numbers later. They want to see how the guy looks while doing it. And I think it's just that push for more and more information. Mike, you had a chance to talk to a lot of different players. You obviously have also done a ton of content for NHL.com, including mock drafts and different things like that. But since you did mention some of the stuff that Jarmo Kekalainen had said, and of course the GM of the Columbus Blue Jackets, you know, I don't know how many other executives you had a chance to talk to, but was there any other kind of different, I don't know, buzz or different things that they were talking about, whether it was certain players, how guys interviewed, if there was anybody that, any kind of scuttlebutt in terms of, who's really rising or, maybe not, that came out of that? Or was there anything that you just kind of like, you kind of make note of? And that's why I was so disappointed to miss Saturday, because that's typically what'll happen. You'll get that little nugget of something that you hear here or there from different people that you talk to. I just wonder if there was anything that kind of sparked your interest that you heard over the course of the weekend there.
Yeah, well, there were a few executives that I was able to shoot the breeze with a little bit, and it seems like, as far, well, even Yarmo, he was asked about a possible trade, about trading down if there was a possibility there,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, and I spoke to one other executive, and they said the same thing, that it's been very difficult to really put together a trade for a high draft pick in this draft. And I think it just has to do with the fact that it is a decent draft. And,
Right.
this is a draft that's full of elite caliber forwards. We're seeing a number of elite caliber forwards and centermen, right-handed centermen. Yes, there are some good defensemen in this draft as well, right-handed D. But it seems
Yeah.
like forward-wise, if you're looking to stockpile, possible, top 6, maybe a middle 6, type forward, this is the draft to do it. So a lot of teams want to stockpile their draft picks, but it's been very difficult to make these trades for either high picks or to get multiple picks in the draft. I believe right now there might be 6 or 7 teams with multiple picks
Yeah.
in the first round, with the St. Louis Blues, I believe, having 3. But besides that, also, Chris, I talked to a lot of people about just the overall experience of the combine. And I just
Yeah.
do want to mention that NHL Central Scouting, the city of Buffalo, the NHL, they really do a real good job with this. I mean, there's been some talk
Absolutely.
about what's going to happen, when the Sabres finally get good and they start getting, going 1, 2, 3 rounds into the playoffs. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen then? Apparently they have a plan, but they're not going to tell us. So we'll find out, I guess, when it happens. But in the meantime, it really is, an experience in Buffalo. I think they've really, it's at a point right now where it runs like clockwork. It's a well-oiled machine, the way they operate going into Saturday with the testing. So I asked a lot of the executives too, and several scouts about the interviewing process, and if they still ask those wacky questions. A lot of the executives say they don't like asking those questions anymore because it
Right.
kind of makes the players uncomfortable, particularly the European players. And I talked to Mike Dennehy about this, the director of amateur scouting for the Chicago Blackhawks, and he says we don't
Yeah.
ask, what animal do you think you'd be, or some of those crazy,
Somebody
some of
did
those.
this year.
Yeah,
So
well, yeah, that was the big question last year. But I think a lot of
right.
the players,
Right.
knowing that question was asked last year, kind of prepared for it. So, for
Right.
instance, a player like Matteo Mann from Chicoutimi in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, uh, Matteo said that he knew that this question was going to be asked, and it was. I think he told me of his. I think he had 7 or 8 interviews. He said of those interviews, maybe 2 or 3 teams did ask him the animal question, and he says he was prepared. He said a giraffe off the ice, and he said a rhino on the ice. Now, rhino, right, Chris? Right? This kid goes about 6'5", 230
He's a
pounds, so
large
he can
human.
say
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
He can say the rhino. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. If Gavin Brindley said rhino, we'd have. Although I say bulldog for Gavin Brindley,
yeah, yeah.
but yeah, or pit bull maybe actually. Yeah. So yeah, but the no, and honest, I'm glad you brought that up too because I do think that there was, at some point those questions, what value do they really present? A
Mm,
lot of teams have also started engaging more sports psychologists, more performance people, and
hmm
different people that have that. And I've always thought too, like NHL teams should invest more in journalists, and have start asking some of those fair questions or those hard hitting questions. I don't know if I'm making a plug for journalists for scouting staffs or whatever, but the fact is like, you you want to make sure that I think putting those players in positions where they're going to be uncomfortable with questions, and there have definitely been questions over the years that probably crossed the line at some point, but
yeah.
I did not hear that at all this time around. I think there's a lot more that players are prepared for. The one thing I did hear from some NHL teams was just how polished a lot of players are in this
Oh
setting
yeah.
now. They're much more polished and prepared than they have been in years previous. And that actually, they don't like that, because it's like you don't feel like you're getting to know the real person, which I think is a factor. You want to get to know these guys on a personal level. And the key thing that you'll tell every player is just be yourself. It's really hard when you have your whole life ahead of you, and this is the biggest interview you've ever been on, and probably the first interview you've ever been on. So it's an interesting factor there, but so many interesting things. One thing I did want to ask you about, it was also about who wasn't there. And we, Dan Marr was asked, the director of Central Scouting was asked about the Russian prospects at the NHL draft. He did say that they did put out invitations to those players, but it was basically, if you can get here, great. If not, if you happen to be in the country, there wasn't going to be like an extra, you couldn't really, getting players visas and different things like that is a much bigger challenge, and given the current state of affairs. So we didn't have any Russian players there. So I want to ask you about them not being there. What I will say though is obviously this year, Matvei Michkov is the guy that we're all going to talk about, but Dmitry Simashev, Mikhail Gulayev, Daniel Boot, they're players that have a real opportunity, to go in the first round or to be, higher picks in this draft. Did you get any sense from anybody there about whether there's more hesitancy, less hesitancy, or if, or also particularly as it pertains to Michkov, who is such a special player? Like, cause I've talked to a few teams, or I've talked to a few sources throughout the league, but that'll say, there are some teams that still very much believe Matvei Michkov should be among the first 5 picks of this draft. Whether or not that happens is another story. So I don't know if you caught any wind of anything or anything based on what you've heard, given the Matvei Michkov situation.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it's funny you raised this question. This was something that Adam Kimmelman, my colleague at NHL.com, and I have discussed a lot on our podcast, and it should be discussed, right, Chris? And
Yeah.
there are a lot of good Russian-born players that are playing overseas this year that legitimately, if they were in the combine and scouts were able to get into Russia to have in-person scouting sessions with these players and not just video scouting, that a lot of these players would go in the first, second round. Now, that being said, in last year's draft, we were almost in the same position. 2
Right.
Russians were taken in the first round. There were 3 more taken in the second round. Look, in a hockey bubble, Michkov's deserving of the first overall selection. The ongoing war in the Ukraine provides a major challenge to selecting this player, as does the fact he signed in the KHL through 25-26. If a team is picking that high, it wants some assurances that the player will come over and play. Last year, we saw, 2 likely top 10 Russian picks fall to 20 and 24, and Ivan Miroshnichenko to the Caps, Daniela Yurov to the Wild, respectively. Neither of those two, exceptional players, mind you, neither of those two carry the same kind of cachet that Michkov does.
Right.
So, that being said, whoever is picking inside the top 5 is likely a team that needs a player of this caliber sooner rather than later. So, if you're able to guarantee that you can get the player out of the country, you then have a lengthy contract with his SKA club in Russia you'll have to
Yeah.
negotiate out of. For these reasons, it's not out of the question a player of Mishkov's talent falls on draft day. But when talking to a lot of scouts, and basically I was asking scouts about this, not necessarily the few executives that I was able to talk to, but some of the scouts, it's just a little up in the air. They don't know how to gauge. And the majority of the people that I spoke to, Chris, said they won't. This is probably something that won't be determined until a day or two, probably before the draft, because they'd want to get
Right.
all the information needed as close to the draft as possible to find out the status, what's going on with the players, these particular players. But there's no question, Chris, that these are exceptionally talented players. And we both know after maybe the first 3 or 4 picks anyway, maybe even the top pick, I don't have the percentages in
Yeah.
front of me, but these guys have to marinate. They have to develop. They have to grow. They have to learn, particularly when they're playing overseas before they get to North America and play in the best league in the world. So to me, what's the difference? Like, if you have a chance to get a player that, let's face it, a year and a half ago, we were comparing him to Connor Bedard. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh. Is
exactly.
Matvei
And
Michkov?
it was,
Yeah,
yeah, it wasn't, and it's not a stretch. And I know people balk at that when we talk about that. I'm Mike. This is a player that is incredibly special. I mean, is
yeah.
he? It's insane how smart he is with the puck on his stick. I mean, it really is, and you would put him ahead of Bedard in that category, which just seems insane to say, but that's what we've seen, and in these head-to-head settings. And so now, like I've heard that Michkov's coming to the draft, which is interesting. Now, I haven't independently confirmed that, but I've heard from multiple people that he's going to come, which means that there are probably going to be there's going to be a rush for teams to try to meet with him in person. And you're right, it could come down to those last 2 days before the draft, and then all of a sudden it's like, are we doing it or are we not? And
Right.
I think I talked about it last week on the podcast. I think you could start having the discussion more seriously at 7. Is the more 7 to 9? I don't think he goes beyond those picks
Mm.
because there is a gigantic gap to me, at least for me, between him and whoever else would be there. Because he is that special of a talent. But it's going to be fascinating to see. It's certainly the question of the draft. It's going to be one of the most fun things to track because nobody really knows for sure. Who's to say that the Ducks don't throw the most gigantic curveball that we couldn't possibly imagine? But
I tell you, and
Mike,
Chris,
we're
that's funny you say that because you're getting fans on Twitter. After I tweet out, hey, this is where I have Michkov going in my mock draft, and then in my first mock draft, I had him going number 3. In this past mock draft after the combine, I had him going 6. Now in my last mock draft, I'll probably have him going high again, just because it's been fluctuating so much based on what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing, what I'm reading. So it's ridiculous, but wherever you have him ranked, like fans will tweet back at you, "Oh, I'm so glad you have him going later because now I know that
that my team has a
Anaheim.
chance.
Now I know that San
Yeah.
Jose has a chance to select him." So I'm thinking to
Yeah.
myself,
Yeah.
well, maybe the fans are willing to wait, right? Yeah,
I think so. The interesting thing, Mike, is that now more people have access, and we cover this. A lot of people cover this. There's never been more access to information about these players. You're getting to learn about them
yeah.
more, and if you listen to this podcast, you're getting a chance to learn about. So yeah, so I mean, I think it's fascinating. I think there's so much that I can't wait to dive into even more. But Mike, this whole draft season, it's been absolutely wild to follow. I mean, you've talked to all the top guys. You've been there from the very beginning. I mean, but now we're almost to the end, and it's been a very fun one to track. So I just have my last question for you. We've talked a lot about him. We're going to continue to talk a lot about him. The generational term has gotten tossed around about Connor Bedard. You've spoken with him, you've watched him, you've been around him. Um, I mean, just how special, in the years that you've been doing this, where you've been focused on the draft, and that goes back a ways, and you've been able to talk to many of the top players. Are there any commonalities between Connor Bedard and the Bick Davids and the Jack Hugheses and the different guys that you've spoken with that have been number 1 picks? And then maybe what are some of the things how are the ways that you found him differently, not just as a hockey player, but as a person, having had more interaction with him?
Yeah, great question, Chris. And I'll say this: two things here. First, on the ice, and a lot of times, when I'm hearing, a lot of pundits, a lot of people predicting what Bedard will be in the NHL, I hear, okay, he's got the shot of Austin Matthews, and he's got the skating of Connor McDavid. I'll say the Austin Matthews comparison is right there, if not Bedard. At his age, once he, another 3-4 years in the NHL, to think that it's going to get even better is just a scary thought. But the shot is just
Yeah.
incredible. So the skating thing is what has me on the fence a little bit, and
Right.
here's why. So McDavid to me is the best skater in the world. There's no
Ever.
question
Yeah.
about it. Um,
Yeah.
North-south, power, that's Connor McDavid, allowing the puck to do a lot of the work, but he's a north-south type skater. Now, Bedard, when he's coming at you, it's a little bit more east-west, because what I find, and through a lot of video that I've watched, and I've seen him live several times too with Regina, top prospects, when he's skating at an opposing defenseman or an opposing player, whoever it might be, he's looking to go east west, and wherever that opposing player might be tilting, whether it's to the left, to the right, then Bedard will take that and either go left or right, depending on how that player is shifting his body weight. So there's a lot going on there, right, Chris? There's IQ
Oh yeah.
going on there. There's speed. There's
Absolutely.
lateral movement. There's ability to handle the puck at top speed, which he does. So while I do think he's a very good skater, it's different to me than the way Connor McDavid skates, and it's a good thing. He's
Yeah.
a powerful skater, and who knows? I mean, I mean, he's got the legs. He's got the tree trunks. I mean, it's ridiculous
Yeah,
watching him
yeah,
on the
he has a
VO2 when he was
great
going
lower
at it.
body. Yep, yep,
Yes, it's like Marty St. Louis, right? So
yeah,
he's eventually going to get there with more training, and he'll eventually maybe be able to do what McDavid's doing now. But for now, that's the way I see Bedard. But the
yeah,
thing for me, Chris, and I can't get over this, when I visited Regina and sat down with Bedard for the 15, 20 minutes I had, we sat in the stands, and I've been doing this since '08, since I came to NHL.com, doing the prospects, the combines. When there's real big names, I'll maybe go out to those cities to watch these players if I have the opportunity. And I had the opportunity here to go out to Regina. I had a chance to sit down with Melanie Bedard, Connor's mom, and we chatted about his life, what it was like growing up, how great a player he is, where he gets all this from, the hardworking family that he's with his dad being a logger. Um, eh, you know, and the thing that really strikes me is when you sit down with Bedard, you know, he's very personable and wants to know about you too. Like, he was concerned when I sat down with him. Did you find some place to eat around here? Like, I could point you to some different areas, or if you have an off day, I can tell you maybe some things to visit. Just stuff like that. Like, I've never had a 17-year-old kid prospect do that. And to me, that's it might sound crazy, Chris, but it just kind of sets them apart. Like, those are the things that I
yeah,
remember when you speak to these kids. And the other thing I'll say is that Regina had two big autograph sessions during the course of the season. Both times they started at about 6:30, 7 o'clock Regina time. And, the PR department told me that they lasted until about 11:30 at night. And Bedard was the only player there with a tremendous, mile-long line, still signing autographs, still
yeah,
taking pictures. So it's something that's, ingrained in him. It's something that's very important to him. The fans, he always talks about the fans. And he's going to be that type of player, right, Chris? You could just see it. You can sense it in him that he has that Sid type persona about him, that when the time comes and he's mature enough and maybe he's wearing the C, who knows, that he's going to have those type qualities where he'll sit in front of his stall, speak to the media every night after a game, for 15 to 20 minutes, do the fan stuff with the autographs, and be that type of athlete that's a community leader for that organization. Chicago's getting a fantastic pick here, but those are the things that really stand out to me when I think of Connor Bedard.
yeah. You're so right. I've thought that as well. I think that the thing that sets him apart is that there's never been a brighter spotlight on him,
Mm,
like on any player. It feels like even McDavid to a certain extent, because McDavid exists. That's only intensified the spotlight on Bedard, and so he's handled it beautifully. I asked him at the combine before I got sick. I said, are you tired? Like, is this and it's just he just views it as part of the process, as part of what he has to do. And he clearly loves the game to a degree that few players that can really even hold a candle to. And then on top of that, he is able to, I think when he in the media, sometimes he can come across a little bit more of the robotic, but like you see him interact with
right.
other people. I mean, he's kind of going through the motions. He's been doing this for over a year, where everybody wants a piece of him, and he's been very giving of himself to a lot of people, and in those autograph sessions and other things like that. And also
Yep.
think about the boon he was for the WHL, where it wasn't just Regina that was selling out games. It was every single building he played in, including some NHL buildings that he was playing in. So pretty amazing to see what he did. But Mike, I love your work, but I like you even more as a person. You're a great friend, and really a pleasure to have you on here. You're absolutely one of the hardest working people I've ever been around. And so if anytime I can get insight from you and share it with this audience, I'm going to do it. So thank you so much for coming on Talking Hockey Sense this week. Can't wait to see you in Nashville. It is going to be an absolute blast.
That's fabulous. Thanks so much, Chris. It was a pleasure being on. Keep up the great work. You're fantastic in what you do in promoting the game, promoting the sport, and promoting, our future stars of tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to Nashville. We got to make up some time here, buddy.
we do, and I am certain we will. So
Yes.
so thanks a lot, Mike. It's a pleasure, buddy. Thanks for popping on with us.
Thanks,
All
Chris.
right, Mike. That is Mike Morreale from NHL.com. You can also check him out on NHL Draft Class, and certainly read his work there. And sometimes you might even see him pop up on NHL Network from time to time. So, Mike, absolutely one of the nicest guys in the business. Love having him around. But we're going to move on to a Q&A. So we had a great conversation with Mike. I think we even went a little bit longer than we planned to. But I'm going to rip through some questions here that I got from a number of listeners, and we've gotten, we do this every episode, but I want to start things off and start getting into the Q&A here so that we can hit a few more topics that I might not have hit with Mike. And as I mentioned, tons more content on FloHockey.tv, a lot of written stuff coming. There's going to be a little bit more on, the Vegas Golden Knights and, what we can learn from them, because this is a team that was not really built from the draft, but they did have some lessons to be learned for the draft. And then we're also going to have more mock drafts, and certainly we got to get to our late round sleepers and different things like that you'll see soon. All right, so moving on and talking about our Q&A, we're going to get our first question here from Corey. And Corey asks, how many players do you think play next year in the NHL? It's a great question, because I think that the number it has the potential to be a small one, actually. As good as this class is and as outstanding as it is, I think it's not a given that we're going to see players come in. I think there's going to be a maximum of 3 players that we see enter the NHL next season. Now, that could be maybe shift that by a number or 2. I do think Connor Bedard is going to be ready to go to the NHL. I do think Adam Fantilli is ready as well, but I don't know with 100% certainty, given whatever situation the NHL team that takes him in, do they need him right away? Like, so let's say Columbus takes him. I think they absolutely have him in the lineup right away. Anaheim, in a bit of a different phase of their rebuild, maybe they allow him to go back to Michigan for another year, because we saw what a tremendous benefit that was to Matty Beniers and Owen Power. That said, Adam Fantilli just won the Hobey Baker, so maybe not. We'll see. And then Leo Carlsson, I think, has a chance to play in the NHL, but I think it's much more likely he plays a more substantial role in the SHL next season, or, and then they bring him back to North America a year after that. Again, if Columbus picks him, there could be a case made that they put him on their roster. I don't think he'd be ready to play center in the NHL in year 1, but I do think that if you gave him an opportunity to go back to the SHL, play center there all season, and playing against men, I think that might be the best for his long-term development. So, I think that there is a good chance that the only player we see is Connor Bedard. But that's not set in stone. So I think Bedard and Fantilli and Carlsson are the guys. I don't think Will Smith we'd see right away. Nate Danielson could probably use another year of junior. Zach Benson at his size, I don't think that any team would be rushing him into the NHL. David Reinbacher, you want to maybe get him to North America, maybe do what happened with David Juracek last year. See if you could get him into the AHL this year. That might be the best play. So those are the types of things that I could see happening, but not many in the NHL proper. All right, our next question comes from Kenneth. And Kenneth asked this last week. I wasn't able to get to it, and I'm glad he asked it again this week on Twitter. And again, you can always hit me up at Chris M. Peters on Twitter. But from Kenneth, he asked, where would you rank Shane Wright if he was in this year's draft? Now, Shane Wright, of course, went 4th overall last year after spending most of the year as the presumed number 1. We're not going to have that scenario this year. And I think if you were to put Shane Wright in this draft class, there's a chance he'd be deeper into the top 10. And that's with the benefit of hindsight, because I think that what was exposed a little bit in Shane Wright's game this year was that there is still a need for some more maturity, some more strength, a little bit of improvement in various areas of the game. He's had good moments when he's played at the AHL level this year. He went back, had a very strong showing in junior. We expected him to, didn't necessarily have a great playoffs. So I think that, he would probably slot in for me let's take away Uri Slafkovsky, Logan Cooley, and I had Cooley as number 1 last year and then Wright number 2. But I think that, where Wright ended up going may have ultimately been the best spot for him. I think you could potentially even make a case that David Juracek should have gone ahead of him. But again, we're still very early in the process of Shane Wright and finding out what he'll ultimately be. But I do think that we're going to see, because of this year's draft, I would absolutely have Bedard, Fantilli, Carlsson, possibly Will Smith, ahead of him in that case. I think that you could make a case for a couple of the other guys, Ryan Leonard. But I think rare in that maybe 5, 6, 7 range is where I would start to see Shane Wright. And that I'd also have Michkov ahead of him as well. So good question. I don't think there's anything to worry about in terms of Shane Wright's long-term projection, just because we're putting him further back in this draft. But absolutely, I think that we ran into a hype machine last year. It didn't really come to fore. The teams cooled on it at the right time. I think the Seattle Kraken are still going to have a player that's going to be with them for a long time. But in the end, he would have gone lower in this year's draft. All right, our next question comes from Jesse, and this touches on the Russian prospect thing. Extremely selfish question here. Any chance that Daniel Boot is still available at 21? After the Minnesota Wild snagged Yurov at 24 last year, I wouldn't mind taking another high-ceiling Russian winger that other teams are afraid to take with their first. Absolutely a possibility. I think that Daniel Boot is one of the most intriguing players of this entire draft. A 6'5" forward that can score. Not a great skater, but high-end hands, good shot. I think that he's going to be the kind of guy that will probably slide in that, could be in that 20, maybe that 18 to 23 range. Could be a range that we see Daniel Boot go, because he has those skills on top of that big frame. Just like all the other Russian players, there is going to be an element of risk. I think the teams will cool on that a little bit. I think that if they feel that player, especially in the 20s, that's where I think you start to feel more comfortable taking him. I think if you're a team that had multiple first-round draft picks, you're emboldened to take a swing on a higher upside player. But if you're the Minnesota Wild and he's there, now you've already got Yurov. Do you want to double down on the Russian front? Maybe. You'll also have to see what else is available to you. And, I think that getting another scoring winger, getting more goal support, absolutely would go a long way for the Minnesota Wild. I think you can't have enough skill. Daniel Boot has plenty of it, but certainly there's the risk factor there, because he is still pretty raw as well. All right, our next question as we move on from that. Great question. I love talking about Daniil Boot and Danila Yurov, who is a very good player as well. But this one comes from Brian, and we're going to go back to the Columbus Blue Jackets. And he asks, if the Columbus Blue Jackets select Leo Carlsson at number 3, is a realistic timeline next season, given it sounds like he's headed back to the Swedish League? So we did touch on this. I think that the best path forward for him is probably Sweden. But I think if you're the Columbus Blue Jackets, maybe you try to give him every opportunity in camp to see if he can be a fit for your roster right now. And if he's not, you send him back. I don't think there's any sense in rushing a player. And you are often going to make more mistakes. There's very few players that come too late. There are scores of players that came too early. And so I would say that Leo Carlsson is a great example of a player that's kind of in the middle right now. And there are things that he can learn in Sweden. It doesn't matter that he's not playing on North America ice. He just needs to play center as a pro more. He's not going to be able to do that in Columbus, I don't think. We'll see if there are other options available to them. I don't think that the AHL would be an option given his age and the way that Sweden kind of works with their contracts. So I think that he would have to go back to Sweden. And ultimately, that may be the best move long-term for him. It would be disappointing, I think, if you are a Columbus Blue Jackets fan to have to send him back, but nobody else you're picking there has even an inkling of a chance, I don't think, to make it in the NHL next season. All right, we got one more question, and there are a couple that I didn't get to. I will try to work them in next week, but this one comes from Full Metal Ninja, and this is going in a different direction, so we're not just talking about all the top guys here. This question is, the most overlooked prospects every year seemingly are guys who skate fast, play with ill intent, and intimidate on the ice. Who are the wrecking balls that every other city will hate, but teammates and hometown fans will love? That's a good question. And actually, I said we wouldn't talk about it as much for the top guys, but probably one of the biggest wrecking balls in this draft is Adam Fantilli. He's the number 2 prospect on our list, largely because of the aggression that he plays with and that speed that he has on top of the high-end skill that he's able to execute with. So he's one of them. Another guy to keep in mind, he's not necessarily a big guy, but he's a guy that I think plays with reckless abandon and is very in your face and gritty. And that's Callan Lind. He goes after everybody. He was just he's a bit of a pest, and then he also plays physically. He's hard on the forecheck. He's not afraid to drop the gloves. I think that guy plays with a lot of aggression. I think you see elements of that from Ryan Leonard. I think that you can see elements of that even from Colby Barlow at times. That not that he's running guys over, but he plays with some of that aggressiveness. I think Charlie Stramel is another guy with just that size, the burliness. When he does hit, it makes a statement. So not a guy that skates fast or is a forward, but one of the hardest hitters of this draft is Brady Cleveland, who is on our top 100, way towards the back, limited offensive upside, but an incredible athlete, had a very good showing at the Scouting Combine, and he hits people hard. And he also had one of the most violent junior hockey fights I think I've seen in some years earlier this year, but very tough, can play with a bad attitude when he wants to. Then there are other guys that aren't necessarily like playing with reckless abandon, but play, the game pretty hard. And that's guys I'm thinking like Zach Wisdom from the Cedar Rapids Rough Riders, a guy that really gets after it and, is able to be good on the forecheck and provide some of that. He's got some speed. He's got some good size and strength to him. He's going to Colorado College next year. So, there are a lot of really good players that I think play that physical style game. And, we haven't talked about it much because we've been talking about the draft, but the Vegas Golden Knights just won the Stanley Cup with a big, heavy team. A guy like Keegan Colasar, you hate to see Matthew Tkachuk get injured, but Colasar, not just when he was hitting and injured Matthew Tkachuk, he's a heavy player, plays with a lot of physicality. Nicholas Waugh, same thing. They're guys that are bigger, heavier players, and it allows them, teams like that to push other teams around. NHL teams are going to do that in a copycat way. There aren't a ton of draft lessons we can learn from the Golden Knights because they mostly traded a lot of their picks. Nick Hague was the only regular that was an originally drafted player. And then they had Zach Whitecloud, who was an undrafted free agent that they signed. But that's a team that plays heavy, hard, physical hockey. When Florida was going at their best, Matthew Tkachuk was being a disruptive player, both physically and with the skill. So, I mean, there is still a premium on that. And so those types of players are still going to have a lot of people that are interested in them at the NHL level. But we have run over time, and I am really hoping that you guys enjoyed that. I know I love talking to Mike Morreale. I really appreciate everybody that asked questions today. A huge thanks is going to go out to Kyle Grover, who produced today's show. And, all of you that have been listening, the numbers continue to go up as we get closer and closer to the draft. You're watching it on YouTube. You're watching it on FloHockey. You're downloading it on your audio app of choice, and that is awesome. Please consider making a review, a written review on Apple Podcasts, and leave kind ratings and do all that, because it really does help the podcast move up the charts. This is obviously our big time of year. We've got so much coming. Next week is our NHL Draft preview special. We'll have so much more. I should have a guest or two, and I'll also have a lot more intel as we head into the draft. You are not going to want to miss that episode. We will get as much information to you as we can to prepare for the draft, which is on June 28th in Nashville. I will be there, ready to cover it. Hopefully I won't get sick again and miss things, but I'm really excited to continue on and really excited to bring it all to you right here on Talking Hockey Sense. That is going to do it for this week's episode. My name is Chris Peters. This is Talking Hockey Sense. We'll catch you next time.